The next segment here, part 5, is the one training course that we were involved in to prepare us to journey via jump room to the planet Mars. So let's take a look at this. In the summer of 1980, here I am with my dear old dad at my brother's wedding in 1985. This is about 5 years later. My dad's health was really actually peaking, and he was really in vital good health during the early 80s. But still was a man who had lost 1/3 of his heart tissue during his heart attack in 1977, and at this point in the summer of 80, he had 11 segments of artery, 11 bypasses in his chest. So while he was very physically vital, his medical record on paper was very compromised. He was apparently in very poor health on paper. But because of proper diet and exercise, he really started to rally physically. And he wanted to go with me to Mars, right from the beginning, as father and son. And we ultimately accomplished that, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. He approaches me at our house in Chatsworth, California, and says, "Son, we're going camping this summer." And I said, "Oh, our mom," and then I asked about one of my older brothers, "Are they going too?" And he said, "No, it's just going to be you and your dad." And I said, "Well, where are we going?" And he said, "Lake Siskiyou, near Mount Shasta." And here's the beautiful Lake Siskiyou. There's a campground on the northern side of the lake over here that looks like it's right beneath Mount Shasta. It's an incredible location. And this is a very beautiful picture of it, but I would definitely urge anybody in this audience who hasn't been to Shasta in the summer to do it at least one summer. It's phenomenal. And so I had remembered Lake Siskiyou from a previous camping trip with a greater number of my family members. And so early one morning, we put our tent in our boat, and one Saturday morning at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, just got onto the I-5 corridor and started traveling north to Shasta from Chatsworth, actually to Lake Siskiyou from Chatsworth, California. And that was roughly, our trip was roughly undertaken around August 15th of 1980. The first strange thing that happened on our trip was when my dad exited at exit 745, if you're familiar with the I-5 corridor in Northern California, essentially you get into Siskiyou County, which is a very large county, and at exit 745, you go to the northeast for about 9 miles on that exit before reaching the town of McLeod, California. In those days, the parking lot in front of the McLeod Market was much larger, and it had been sort of poured over unplaned earth. So there were sort of these bumps in the parking lot. My dad pulled our station wagon and our boat onto the parking lot at a pretty far distance from the front of the store. And he then turned to me in the car and said, "Son, I'm going to be in the store for about 15 minutes, and I have to ask you that whatever you do, don't leave the car. Unless the car catches on fire, stay in the car." And I said, "Okay, Dad, whatever." And so my dad goes into the store. He comes out 15, 20 minutes later, but where he had been clean shaven when he gave me the advisement in the car, he now had a 5-day growth of beard. The kind of beard we always teased him about, how he looked like Ernest Hemingway when he grew his beard out. And I said, "Dad, what happened?" He says, "Nothing, son. I just went into the store, looked around, saw what was there, if we had to come down here and buy some groceries." And he hadn't bought any groceries. That was another clue. And I said, But Dad, when you left the car, you were clean shaven, and now you have like a 5-day growth of beard on. What happened?" He said, "Nothing, son. You know how I always let my beard grow out when we go camping. You know how you're always teasing me about looking like Ernest Hemingway? That's just what's happening. We're on the trip, and my beard's been growing." And that was not credible, because we had just driven up from Chatsworth on the first day of the trip. Unbeknownst to me, that a couple hours later, Thomas Stillings brought his young son, William Stillings, to the same store in McLeod, and the same event transpired. His dad admonished Brett to stay in the car, went into the store for 50 minutes, came out, and had about a 3-day growth of beard, because as Brett has explained, his dad actually took out a battery-powered electrical shaver and shaved his beard before going into the store, but still had about a 3-day growth of beard when he got out. So apparently what happened is they time looped. They were sent somewhere, They had a 1 or 3 or probably a 5-day seminar about what was going to transpire that summer, and then they were teleported back to the present and walked out of the store. When William Stillings and I reconnoitered the McLeod Market in 2011, there was a drunken soldier across the street from the McLeod Market. And, I should say, somebody dressed as a U.S. Army soldier who was feigning drunkenness. Because when he came down to the side of the door, the right side of the right window of my car, he said in a clear, non-inebriated voice, a sober voice, so what's going on, guys? And I actually told him the whole story. I said, my dad was with Parsons, his dad was at Lockheed Skunk Works, and Bendix, and NASA JPL. And when we were young men, we were brought up here by our fathers, and we got training up at the college, which is only exit 747. It's 2 exits north of exit 745 to McLeod, College of the Siskiyous. And he said, what about? You were apparently involved in some defense project? He said, yeah, then they sent us to Mars via jump room. And he said, wow, and he's not drunk. And he said, wow, that's really heavy, guys. Every once in a while people come through here telling those kinds of stories. And then I said to him, I leaned across Brett and I said, officer, is it pretty much in our interest to leave this area immediately? And he said, yeah. So he's basically some kind of domestic security operative who was keeping an eye on what? The McLeod Market, where our fathers had taken us 30 years previously, and after 15 minutes each came out of that store with days of beard growth. So clearly they were using time travel to brief people in the intel community there for these kinds of projects. Here's Brett at about the age 13 that he was that summer. Here's Brett today. I always commend my friend William Stillings about the fact that had he not come forward and contacted me in March of 2010, I never would have recaptured my memories, and I wouldn't be talking to you today about the Mars Jump Room program. Brett has remembered with great clarity what happened, and in the way that I defeated my brainwashing after leaving Project Pegasus, Brett defeated the brainwashing that was imposed on all of us by the CIA after being trained at College of the Siskiyous that summer, and then after serving in the CIA's Mars Jump Room program. Now, the next strange thing that happened is, well, I'll just give the kind of prescript to this. My dad and I pitch our tent on the lakes at Lake Siskiyou there on the northern side of the lake, and a couple hours later, Brett arrives with his dad, and his dad says to my father, "You may not know me, but we work for the same company," which wasn't the company of Jesus. It wasn't saying they were Jesuits. It was the CIA, right? As they were using in that era, that the CIA was simply the company. And his father then had Brett go to their uniquely pumpkin-colored minivan, which I identified to Brett before he sent me a scan of the photographs of that vehicle with this, this sort of late or mid 1970s pumpkin orange kind of color, if you remember that era. And he had Brett get a box out of the back of the car, and he showed me what he had, which was Tom Stillings had a piece of metal that was about 2 inches wide and about 6 inches long. And he said, "Now watch this, Andy." And he bent down and he let go of the metal, and it hovered about 6 inches off the ground. And he said to my dad, I've showed this to my son, to Brett, but I don't have to show this to you, Ray, because you work with this. And again, this is the aerospace involvement with magnetics, anti-gravitics, and so forth that was already ongoing by summer of 1980. My dad had designed the metal alloy with which the ramjet was built, and apparently now was being consulted about what Tom Stillings called our boundary layer materials. So that was strange, having this little demonstration of this little hovering piece of metal. Not basically arresting the forces of gravity, but basically reverse magnetic propulsion. Basically, the polarity of the metal and the polarity of metals in the soil were causing the kind of effect when you put the same poles of 2 magnets together, you get kind of that pushing. Well, they had a form of metal alloy that actually hovers as a result of that effect. So that was the big event of the first day there, Saturday, the day we had arrived. the next day, Sunday, we're sitting around. We've had lunch, because we kind of bonded as, you know, two fathers and sons as neighbors there in the campground. And precisely at 1 p.m., both of our dads stand up and start walking diagonally across the campground. And so Brett and I, being age 13 and 18 respectively, were certainly more fit than our dads at that age, and we started skipping ahead of them, seeing the direction they were going. And we went through two cars at an adjacent campsite, and the person who stepped forward in civilian clothing was this man, Edwin Eugene Aldrin, Jr., the U.S. astronaut, a participant in projects Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, the second man to walk on the moon. And he walked through his vehicles. I think it was a sort of a pickup truck and a sedan, and he greeted us. And we obviously had never met Buzz Aldrin before. Brett would have a relationship with, friendship with Buzz long after the jump room program. I just met him this one time at the campgrounds there. And he addressed us. He said, "Andy, Brett, nice to meet you guys. Well, let me tell you, fellas, you're soon going to be doing something that I did a few years back, and that's go off-planet. And let me tell you, guys, it's going to be the experience of a lifetime." So for some reason, they set up this meeting with Buzz Aldrin just to get a sense maybe of normalcy, that leaving the planet was normal or something. And that we would clearly, as individuals born in the 1960s, I in 1961, William Stillings in 1966, we would clearly identify with Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins in Apollo 11. The next morning, we left the campground to go to the University Extension that Monday, not in Weed, California, but the College of Siskiyou Extension building in Yreka, California. But something happened the previous night, so let me describe that. We're sitting around the campfire at about 10 o'clock at night, you know, with all the sparks going up. You can see the whole Milky Way above us. And my dad looks across the campfire at me and says, "Boys," and also addressing Brett, he says, "Boys, you're not here for a camping trip this summer, although we will be camping some of the time. We'll also be staying in hotels. You're here to participate in a specialized curriculum." And I said, "Dad, what are you talking about? We're going to be in school?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "What about?" And he said, "It's going to be a seminar that'll last for about 3.5 weeks, involving everything that you could possibly want to know about the planet Mars." And I said, "Dad, I just took my astronomy breadth requirement at UC San Diego. I'm going to be registering as an English major at UCLA in the fall. You know that." I actually ended up transferring into history. And I said, "You know, I don't plan to become an astronaut. I don't know about Brett's plans, but, you know, what are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, we're going to be going to first the Extension building and then to the Weed campus of College of the Siskiyous." And I said, "Why do we need to know everything about Mars, Dad? Why do we need to break up this vacation with schooling, you know?" And he said, "Because some of you kids in the program are going to be going there." And just as we did after we encountered Buzz Aldrin, Brett and I looked at each other like, "Oh, you know, look what our fathers have gotten us into, right? Fine kettle of fish you've gotten me into now." But so I said, "Dad, you're not kidding." He goes, "Nope." And I said, "Well, what's happened?" He said, "You have been selected among American young people to be some of the first American young people to go to the planet Mars, and you're going to be going there. At least some of you will be. So just give the seminar your best shot. Just listen to everything that's said, try to participate, and try to glean as much as you can from the curriculum." So the next morning we get up and our fathers drive us in a carpool to the College of the Siskiyou Extension in Yreka. We go up the stairs. I remember thinking how prison-like it looked. And we went into the back center. There was a courtyard, and the classroom was in the left side of the inner courtyard of this rather small campus. It was really only like sort of one big connected building. And we then met our instructor, Major Ed Dames, who in 1980, on his own website until recently, was stating that he was a scientific and technical intelligence officer for the U.S. Army in the early 1980s. On November 10th of 2011, during my third appearance on Coast to Coast AM with Brett Stillings and Laura Eisenhower corroborating my account of having gone to Mars, because Brett had and Laura had been invited to do so, Ed Dames called in and denied that he was our instructor, stated that might be some sort of parallel reality event, and then stated the truth about the end of that summer, which he stated that he was stationed in Germany that summer. In fact, he told us at the end of our course that he was going to Germany, and that his girlfriend Marianne from Valencia, California, was not going to be going with him. I don't know if Ed Dames knows the fact that we remember the name of his girlfriend, but we do. He was saying, well, yeah, at the end of this, when we all go home, I'm going to be going to Germany to listen to Soviet troop movements on the Czech border or something. So on Coast to Coast, he alleged that he was in Germany that summer, so couldn't have been our instructor at College of the Siskiyous. And then he began using profanity, and his microphone was cut off. Okay, so I'm just giving the truth of what happened. We do not want to belittle or diminish the reputation of Ed Dames by stating the truth. He was our instructor. So if we're wrong, there is some alternate explanation for who our instructor was. It could have been a twin brother of Ed Dames that they've been working with. It could have been a parallel dimension of his experience where we were on our main timeline and he banked in from an adjacent timeline and was our instructor and then banked out. It could have been somebody imitating him. It could have been a holographic overlay of what we were fundamentally experiencing. But I and William B. Stillings and Bernard Mendez are in absolute agreement, and we have agreed never to back down from the truth of what we experienced, which is that Major Ed Dames, the remote viewing pioneer, was our Mars training officer that summer. In fact, he was Captain Ed Dames, we believe, but he's the guy that trained us. We can't back down from the truth. If he wants to continue to deny that he was in the Mars program, that's his right, but we're going to continue to state what we experienced, which was his tutelage as the scientific and technical intelligence officer from the Army, having been our instructor, and even meeting his girlfriend at that time. After a couple days of instruction from roughly about 8:30 to 2:30, 8:30 in the morning to 2:30 at night or afternoon, we then moved to a bungalow on the Weed campus, the main College of the Siskiyous campus. And then from those hot bungalows, we then moved to the Life Sciences building. So we were actually in 3 training locations when we were in the Shasta region that summer. In that class, which again was this factual overview going from the creation of Mars to what we knew, some of the major things we knew about its humanoid population presently, Dames emphasized that the 3 goals of our service in the Mars Jump Room program were going to be to help establish an extraterrestrial defense regime protecting Earth. And I'm using extraterrestrial there broadly defined, not just to the threat of hostile ETs, but all extraterrestrial threats like incoming asteroids and what have you. Second, to create a basis for claiming U.S. territorial sovereignty over Mars. The thought was that if we could put a presence there with permanent settlers and then periodic visitors, we would stake a claim under public international law to essentially claim that Mars was our sovereign territory as Americans. And then also to acclimate Martian humanoids and animals to our presence. In other words, we were being put there as a show, not of force, but as a show of the presence of Earthlings on Mars. Earthlings from Earth, not from previous contact with Earth. Now, he also explained that the emphasis would be, of the course, would be what to expect upon arriving on Mars via the jump rooms, learning about the lethal and non-lethal predators on the surface. And by this I mean inevitably lethal or not necessarily inevitably lethal predators on the surface, and how to operate as a team on the surface so as to survive. So we did a lot of really far out exercises. I remember one time we had to look at a green box on a bar stool, and Regina Dugan said, we had to then yell out to everybody else in like a staccato sentence structure, just the essence of what was there. And Regina said, a green box on a bar stool, just sitting there. So I was proud that when I came out of the jump room facility on the surface of Mars and I saw one of the gray Martians up on the top of the building, I yelled, Courtney Hunt and Brett Stones were coming out of the jump room behind me into the darkness, sort of dusk, and I yelled, Court, Brett, a gray, on the ceiling, on the roof, observing us. Okay, so we did kind of have training and just staying in touch with our team members on the surface by yelling these short, meaningful sentences. So that succeeded. In fact, I'll tell the story of Bernard Mendez and I rescuing each other's lives in the same event. So next slide, please. Part 6, let's take a look at the 10 teenagers that were involved in our training group. Here's Brett Stillings, again, around age 13 during our training in summer of '80. Here's Brett today. Here is Barack Obama in his famous photographs when he was a first-year student at Occidental College in Eagle Rock, California. That's what he looked like. That's the guy. The three of us agree that was Barry Soetoro. Here is President Barack Obama today. We'll talk about the 2 denials that he's issued about his service. Here's Regina, or also known as, actually I think the correct pronunciation is Regina Dugan. That's what we were apprised of during the program, and that was used when she was the director of DARPA, was Regina Dugan. Here's Regina around the time that President Obama appointed her the first female and the 19th historical director of the agency that gave the U.S. government time travel, namely the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And we continued to have contact with Regina after the program because she was in California at Caltech, having entered Caltech in fall of 1979 as a 16-year-old. So Regina was 17 years old when she was trained to go to Mars. Here is William Cameron McCool, known as Willie McCool, who was born, Regina was born on March 19th of 1963. Willie McCool was 5 days younger than me. He was born on September 23rd of 1961, just as Barry was also close to myself in age. Barry Obama was born on August 4th of 1961, about 45 days before I was, and then another 50 days before William Cameron McCool. Willie McCool was the pilot of, in 1996, when I was becoming a lawyer up in Washington State. Willie had gone on to a career in aviation as a naval aviator who was then at Annapolis when we were being trained, and entered the Space Shuttle Corps as a 35-year-old in 1996. It's never too late to do something different in your life. And sadly, however, he died as the pilot of Space Shuttle Columbia when it was destroyed, re-entering Earth's atmosphere on February 1st of 2003. But Brett and I certainly have fond memories of Willie McCool. I mean, he was basically a cut-up. I mean, I would pass him in the jump room at El Segundo, and he would always do these things where he looked down and he was shocked to see you. And he'd say something like, "So you're still in the program? Oh, God." You know, he was quite a comedian. So it saddens us that he lost his life at such a young age, but in such a courageous way. Okay, the other 5 we don't know. One of the reasons I'm speaking out is so that not only those that we know were involved come forward, like President Obama, but that the other 5 teenagers come forward and contact me. We have the name and hair color of one of the others. His name was Eric, and he was a blonde. We believe he was from San Mateo, California, and we think he was studying either anthropology or physics at UC Santa Barbara. His name may have been either Dutch or Scandinavian, but Eric Schoenwald, or whatever your last name was, Schoenberg, we'd like you to come forward and tell the people about what we were doing back in the early 1980s, which is jumping to Mars. Now, curiously, the 5 that we've been able to identify by name and, by persona, as it were, all had discrete or not so discrete Pasadena, California connections. So let's take a look at those. I was the youngest son of a career special projects engineer for the Ralph M. Parsons Company, which became Parsons Corporation upon creating its 6-acre campus and moving the company from Los Angeles after leaving New York City in Pasadena, California. Barry was then attending Occidental College in Eagle Rock, California, which is basically a suburb of Greater Pasadena. I mentioned how Regina Dugan had entered the California Institute of Technology, the leading sort of brainiac campus in the country, with all the profoundly talented math science type students, as a 16-year-old, the same year that Barry and I entered college in fall of 1979. Brett had several Southern California connections that are conspicuous. His dad was with Lockheed Skunk Works when we were in the jump room program, and then would go on to literally work for NASA JPL in Pasadena, another Pasadena, California connection. And then Willie McCool clearly had a Pasadena, NASA JPL connection in Pasadena, because he became an astronaut, and NASA JPL is headquartered in Pasadena, California. Now, working with Bernard Mendez, in part 7 here, we take a look at what were the 7 traits that with which we believed they selected us. Now, of course, I had been in Pegasus, so I was sort of a known entity as a time traveler, a good errand and so forth, somebody who remembered what he saw when he was time traveling. But actually, Bernard Mendez gave me a kind of bizarre set of traits. Let's take a look at those. He stated basically that you all had to be of very high intelligence. We wanted everybody to have a team orientation. So like I had learned how to cooperate with my 4 older brothers and sisters and so forth. Barry Obama was certainly a kind of a laid-back, type B personality. That we have non-competitive personalities. They didn't want to send chrononauts to Mars that would run up a hill to be the first one to run up the hill. They wanted team members to sit where one team member might turn to the other and say, hey, listen, let's walk up to that hill over there. Because group cohesion was critical, just to not be separated from your group and possibly eaten on the surface. Okay, so we all had to be non-competitive in our personalities, and I think that's also exemplified in the fact that I had a pretty good jump shot in basketball, but I was a terrible wrestler in high school. I just didn't like grappling with somebody. I had had some skin problems as a result of Pegasus, and some major ones. And so I look back at my athletic career and it was not particularly distinguished. I became much more competitive politically and academically, but they still had apparently found that each of us was ultimately self-directed and non-competitive in our activities. We all had to have an affinity for nature. We were the kind of kids who, when we were taken to campsites as little kids, when the tents were being set up, would not help set up the tents, but be all over the location, picking up rocks, checking out pine needles and that whole scene. We had to be intuitive problem solvers. Brett and I have gone back and remembered incidents where we recommended something that would be analogous to Buzz Aldrin using that Bic pen to repair the instrumentation of the lunar module and get them off the surface of the moon. Okay, I got a lot of that wasn't so much intuitive, but that was practical for my father, because my dad was a mechanical genius. In fact, one of his colleagues said at his funeral, he said, Andy, your dad was brilliant. I think you should know that. And I said, well, how do you mean? He said, had he been a better communicator, he would have become president of Parsons. I mean, that's quite a statement, Parsons being one of the world's largest engineering companies. He said he would come up with solutions that just astounded me at how simple they were and creative. Things like, how to do the air. He didn't work on this, but I'm just thinking of the types of things this man was talking about. Like when we designed that air regulator for the Apollo 13, we just cobbled together what would create an air conditioning unit from scratch. This was the kind of genius that my dad had, and some of it rubbed off on me. I think Brett had the same experience with his dad. Curiously, Bernard Mendez said, and also grandiosity. We wanted every last, teenage jumper to basically be a grandiosity case. And I said, why, Bernie? And he said, think about it. You're sending teenagers to another planet. You definitely want them to have like a Christopher Columbus complex, right? So when they looked through our statements of purpose, they were looking for young people who just had a large definition of themselves, even if it was sort of like a mental disorder. But that's curious in light of the fact that this small group of young people were fairly illustrious as a group later in life. And then also there's the possibility that they identified us through future social prominence, using quantum access to the present and saying that Barry would become president, Regina would become director of DARPA, Andy would become a crusading lawyer who would run for president, etc. Willie McCool would become a space shuttle astronaut. But Bernard agreed with me that we had to factor that in. But most of this is actually from Bernie. And Bernie, of course, wasn't really our peer in the program. He was the Air Force investigator who was being put in the program to investigate it and write a report about key questions of what the project was encountering. Like situations where somebody would be killed, literally eaten in half, or have their arm torn off, as I did, by a predator, and then be resurrected or have their limb reattached as if magically by the time they were debriefed by Ed Dames back in El Segundo. So, but yeah, I think of the personalities of, let's say, the captains of the ships when Western Europeans began traveling to the Americas, to the Western Hemisphere. I would certainly want to be sailing with a Columbus or a Vespucci or a Mercator Or who did the circumvention of the world?
Magellan.
Magellan, or Magellan, who had a Napoleonic complex, right? Because you're going out there and your ships are sinking, you're running out of resources, your men are mutinying. I would certainly want to have like a George Washington personality type who had a big self-concept to be safe on the planet Mars. So I think that helped get us over the basic existential fear of being separated from Mother Earth. And it was fearsome. So there were 3 parents who were auditing virtually every class during the training program. I mentioned my dad's involvement. I mentioned in yesterday's lecture how he was the chief technical consultant or liaison between Parsons and the CIA on Tesla teleportation. BS, electrical engineering, Lehigh, 1951, a member of Eta Kappa Nu, associated professionally with the time travel professional organization IEEE. How he had designed the metal alloy so that the ramjet would not melt in our atmosphere or in our near-Earth environment from molecules of air or space dust, respectively. How he had repeated Nikola Tesla's teleportation experiments at the Edison Research Labs in West Orange, New Jersey, during the 8 years that he was employed there between 1956 and 64. So I think this got my dad into the time-space program, in addition probably to his working on sensitive aerospace projects, his mastery of mathematics and physics at Lehigh, and just fate. But there he was in summer of '80, sitting behind me, auditing the class that we were being trained to go to Mars, knowing that he was probably not going to be medically approved to go because of his heart disease and his pulmonary performance as a result of his heart disease. Here's Brett's father, Thomas J. Stillings, when he was a lieutenant with the Office of Naval Intelligence. Tom was often sitting to my father's right in class. At that time, he was an operations analyst at Lockheed Skunk Works, so probably had sort of designed the way that the jump room class was going to unfold and maybe had some ambit over which individuals were selected. He also had a bachelor in engineering. He had the Navy connection that I was given and that Brett was given. He also had attended a naval postgraduate school curriculum, as I had in the evenings when I was at UCLA studying history in the day division. And he later went on to become an employee of NASA JPL. And then sitting a couple seats to his right in the back of the room at the Life Sciences building was the mother, the biological mother of Barack Obama, Stanley Ann Dunham. She was a very nice lady. She had served alternately as a USAID, Agency for International Development consultant in Kenya and Indonesia. She would go on to earn a PhD in anthropology from the University of Hawaii at Manoa by 1993, I think. It's stated by others that she was an agent for the Central Intelligence Agency while traveling to Kenya and Indonesia and marrying into those cultures. And one day she gave us a brilliant afternoon lecture on cross-cultural communications if we encountered Martians directly when we were on the surface. And I remember her referencing the fact that she knew a lot about cross-cultural communications by being in cross-cultural marriages while married to men from Kenya and Indonesia, respectively. She was a delightful person. I feel that the President's mother has been completely besmirched in the press. She was a wonderful human being. She was gracious, funny, intelligent, kind. And Brett and I was just hanging out with her in the classroom. She was a wonderful lady. So, we have this issue in part 9 here of the 2 future presidents. The first thing I remember about Barry Obama, or Satoru as he was then known, is we were coming out of class and he walked alongside me on my left. My dad was on my right. We were walking back to our cars there from the Life Sciences building. And he said, "You know, I really can't believe what we're studying." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "We're being trained to be some of the first people to go to another planet. I mean, how far out is that?" I said, "I know. So some mornings I have to remind myself that that's what we're studying." So he was really thinking with philosophical profundity about what we were being set up to do, which is go to another planet. And Barry was a great guy. I mean, he was smart, thoughtful, considerate, had a good positive attitude. He was funny. And so I'm also mortified when I see all this dirt being thrown at Barack Obama, because quite frankly, when I think about my college-age peers, he was clearly one of the standouts as a human being, as an overall human being. Now, we know that the Barry Satoru we served with and were trained with in this early phase was President Obama, because his kindergarten teacher provided the press, during the birther controversy a year or two ago, provided his academic file from Indonesia, where he had lived from age 5 to 10, and he was identified in his kindergarten file as Barry Soetoro, having been born or come to Indonesia. Well, that must have been 1968 as he was entering that course at his class, and then he was of the Muslim faith, and that his name was Barry Soetoro. And she also provided the group photograph in kindergarten, the first grade, where we see a young Barack Obama circled here being identified as Barry Soetoro. So how many Barry Soetoros can there be in the world? I mean, a Western first name with an Indonesian last name, not too common. Here is Barry and his mom, Stanley, at the time of his high school graduation from Punahou School in Hawaii. This is essentially what they looked like when we met them in the jump room program. Again, the affable mom that Barry had. We also got to know them well because after we left the dorms at College of the Siskiyous, a group of us kind of split off and were staying for days at the Finlandia Motel in the city of Mount Shasta. That included President Obama, myself in this extended picture here, Regina, and Brett, and our parents, and other jumpers. The thing about the presidency began, and did I tell this yesterday, where my dad said 2 future presidents? Okay, yes. So there was a reference by Tom Stillings to his son about how there was a future president class, and then when my dad apprised him that there were 2, Brett says that later, when they left the classroom, his father was just like apoplectic, saying things like, what do they think they're doing? They put 2 future presidents in this program? I mean, this program is dangerous. What are they thinking? So I mentioned that anecdote yesterday, and then that kind of gave way to greater discussion. I mean, Barry's mom, Stanley, was even talking about his future presidency as the first African-American president during the going-away dinner that we had at the Creamery restaurant, which is now basically a tavern and restaurant, but was then kind of a restaurant that featured basically like fancy ice cream dessert type things, which was on College Road there. The front of the restaurant was then on College Avenue, down the street from College of the Siskiyous. Now, during the 3.5 weeks we were all there, Barry, Regina, and I became CIA analysts about a specific data set. We were sequestered. Well, what happened is about toward the end of the program, the end of the 3.5 weeks, Barry, Regina, and I were approached by Ed Dames and my dad and taken to Ed Dames' office, where Ed announced to us that we would all be teleported to the beginning of the summer, spend the whole summer sequestered there at College of the Siskiyous, and then at the appropriate time be reintroduced back into our main group, the main timeline, as it were, that the training course was taking place in. And he said, I know that you will because you already have. In other words, he had already encountered us when we jumped forward to June of 1980. So we were just hanging out in kind of some study corrals at the undergraduate library. There's no graduate library, basically at the library at College of the Siskiyous. How they could pick a future president who would become a Harvard-educated lawyer, the first woman to direct DARPA after getting a PhD in mechanical engineering from Caltech in the early 90s, and a Cambridge-educated lawyer who would become a whistleblower and presidential candidate, I don't know. But I think it was intentional, because what they asked Barry, Regina, and I to do that summer is analyze about 4 inches of French intelligence data about Mars in the French language. And I had taken 2 years of junior high school French and 2 years of high school French, but I basically knew how to count and give the days of the week after all that ended. I'm not a natural linguist. So what is it? Lundi, mardi, mercredi, jeudi, vendredi, samedi, dimanche, or something like that. So I know a little bit of French to maybe count or know what day of the week it is if I look at a French newspaper. But I was just gleaning about 25% of what these 4 inches of data said. I think Regina was fluent and Barry was more fluent than I in French. So we were sequestered there almost to the point of like going into a creative fugue state. I mean, we were really isolated, and we had been told not to talk too much to each other, just to say hi, but not talk about our theses, to keep our theses of what the intelligence data said about the thesis. The question was, do these documents reveal that the humanoid population on Mars is a threat to the humanoid population on Earth? benevolent towards us, or cannot be determined. Which is it? And don't talk to your colleagues, you know. We don't want you, the three of you, talking to each other. At least if you do talk, just to say hi, so that your colleagues have some sense of normality, of, you know, interacting with other human beings during these months you're going to be spending here. We just want you to stick to inconsequential themes. Don't tell them what your thesis is, and arrive at your own opinion. So we were walking at the end of the summer, at the appointed hour. They sent somebody over to our tiny offices over in the dorms, our tiny, you know, living quarters over in the dorms. They were like really tiny one-bed dorm suites, almost like prison cells. And they said, well, your time to rejoin the rest of the group and give Major Dames or Captain Dames your theses has arrived. So we're walking over there. He left, and then we walked over by ourselves to Ed Dames' office. And I said, well, look, we can let to the other two, I said, look, we can let our guard down now because we've already written our theses and we've arrived at our own opinions, and we can't influence each other now. And I said, Regina, what did you determine? And contrary to my opinion, she said, I think they represent a threat. And I said, wait a minute, Regina, I mean, we're engaging in the hegemony of going to their sovereign planet and putting our explorers there. And then she cited the incident in which several of our astronauts had died on the surface of Mars, one of the French intelligence reports indicated. We had asked the human population, our government on Mars, civilization as it were, to rescue our personnel. They agreed to do so, and then they reneged and didn't perform. And those astronauts, those several astronauts, died. I guess of exposure, or starvation, or predation on the surface. Regina believed that that showed that they weren't trustworthy, not because they refused to rescue our personnel, but they declined to after promising to, which shows some malice, was her opinion. I said, but Regina, do you think we're doing that when extraterrestrials come to our planet? This was pre-Roswell, right? But I'm just saying, do you remember hearing any time where they stated as a human right on Earth that if you're an extraterrestrial, you have the right to be rescued by the U.S. government? I mean, you're imposing a higher morality on the inhabitants of a planet that we're proposing on ourselves when territorially aggressing against the Martian population. But she got really angry at me because she believed, now of course she was more adept at French, so maybe she was right. But I didn't read anything that I could read of the French intelligence documents to determine that the Martians were any threat to us. Of course, I had met three very friendly ones as an 8-year-old in summer of '70. And Barry, as is indicated by the fact that he's a highly skillful political tactician because he reached the White House as the first African-American president at age 47, didn't say anything. I said, what about you, Barry? What did you determine? And he said, I can't tell you. And I said, why not? He said, because it's against what we were instructed to do. We have to take this program seriously. We're going to be jumping to Mars. And I said, okay, if you don't want to tell us, but we're just going to deliver the thesis and then never know what the other two researchers had determined. So that's how it fell out. What I guess that since Barry has, I think, been a pretty intellectually capacious president, I mean, if you think about our former presidents, I think he stacks up very well for actually the erudition that he's brought to the presidency and the depth of his analysis. I think what he probably concluded was that it was both. That we were both dangerous to each other because we were on the threshold of interplanetary contact, but that equally both civilizations could be benevolent to each other. He probably gave a kind of a dichotomous or trichotomous kind of answer because it's present in his public statements in other areas. And I know that Regina was taking the hawkish view, I was taking the dovish view, but then again, I became an activist lawyer and not a science officer for the U.S. government or President of the United States, at least not yet. Well, the next summer of 1981, I was placed with one CIA agent, Courtney Maurice Hunt. Now, this isn't a picture of Courtney. This picture is of Mike Roman, the national sales director of the Bulova Watch Company, when he was photographed at the Grand Ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel when Senator Robert Francis Kennedy was shot there on June 5th of 1968. When this picture was scrutinized, an Irish journalist by the name of Shane O'Shaughnessy stated that this was Gordon Campbell of the CIA, somebody who had been involved, at least potentially, in the assassination of President John Kennedy. It was then determined that it wasn't him, but it was in fact Mike Roman, because the Bulova Watch Company, under General Omar Bradley as chairman, was present at a national sales meeting in the Ambassador at the same time that the DNC was meeting there, or at least the Kennedy campaign was meeting there in 1968. I use this photograph because this looks exactly like Courtney M. Hunt looked when I and Brett Stillings were introduced to him in the summer of 1981. He was a career CIA officer who began jumping over enemy lines during the Korean conflict to gather intelligence. In fact, had a bad back as a result of a mishap as a parachutist into North Korea. One of the first things that Courtney did that summer was he took me to a chem lab at Cal State University Northridge. There we see its famous creative sign that you can see CSUN from 360 degrees, and showed me how to use the respirator I was going to be using on the surface of Mars. He also took me to Lockheed Skunk Works, where Brett's father worked, and they had me stand inside this video console that had images, moving images on all four sides walls of this small room, and I had to hold a gun and move around either 90 degrees or 180 degrees every 30 seconds, because that's what we're going to be expected to do on the surface of Mars to protect ourselves and our team members from predation. One of the inevitably lethal predators could run at 70 miles per hour. In fact, Courtney Hunt and I once saw one of the dinosaur-like predators run for about a half a mile at 70 to devour a kind of a water buffalo-like creature. So there was also the trip to Lockheed Skunk Works that Hunt facilitated. Now, can you go forward one, just to, I want to see where I am. Okay, just in back. Because, yeah, here we go. There are essentially, well, here we have Lockheed Skunk Works, where I'm practicing protecting with the gun from predation. Because there's actually two types of predators on Mars. The first are some of these plesiosaur-like creatures that look like turtles with long necks and horse-like heads, like the lake monsters that we've seen. Nessie at Loch Ness, Champ at Lake Champlain in New Hampshire, and Ogopogo in Lake Okanagan in British Columbia. But this thing was not a turtle. It had teeth all the way down its throat. But the benefit was that it really couldn't run as fast as we could, so while it was a predator, we really would have had to be cornered by it almost accidentally, or run up by it, run up upon by it, for it to even get you know, its teeth in our legs or whatever. This was one of the non-lethal predators, but it was a predator. But here was a drawing that's pretty close to what the lethal predators looked like. They basically had heads that looked like T-Rex, although Brett remembers they were a little bit more narrow across the front and a little bit more chicken-like. And they had much more supple bodies like this, like velociraptors as depicted on Jurassic Park. And we were told that we would not, if they were anywhere near us, we would not be able to outrun them. We're actually trained in one exercise at College of the Siskiyous of running in zigzag patterns just to try to get them to become disinterested in eating us, even though we would obviously exhaust ourselves doing so. So this was pretty much the Joker card. Because there were non-lethal predators that I could shoot and repel, but I was also advised to never shoot the lethal predators, the inevitably lethal predators, because all I would do is basically antagonize them. And they were known to sometimes spend hours nibbling at somebody if you had antagonized them. I was given a photo ray gun, and in the backyard, the La Cañada backyard of the Stillings family, Tom Stillings showed me that in the case of small and medium-sized animals, we would just incinerate them into fine ash. And he demonstrated with a goat, and he said, "Watch this, Andy." And he shot about 30 feet across their backyard and turned a young goat just into feathery ash. But then he admonished me, you wouldn't want to put that kind of, you know, that kind of charring on the side of the leg, you know, in a black spot on the side leg of one of the inevitably lethal predators, because he was going to be really mad and spend a slow time eating you. Okay, so this was basically to repel smaller predators. I went off protocol, and I once used it upon Brett's insistence on splitting a rock in half, and water burbled out. And I've been telling that in lectures for several years now, and now NASA has announced that there's water immediately under the surface of Mars. Okay, so even the space agency is starting to corroborate my independent account. But that was the only time, I'm happy to say that was the only time I even fired my gun on the surface of Mars, was just to split the rock in half. I was also given a small dose of, not morphine, what did not strychnine, what's the other poison? I always forget this. You know that Goring took to kill himself?
Cyanide?
Cyanide, thank you. For some reason, I guess because of the word, the stem scion means blue, right? I covered it in Latin stems in English at UCLA, but I can never open my mouth and say cyanide. But yeah, I was given a capsule of cyanide in the event that I would prefer to suicide, for example, rather than being slowly eaten. And I like to refer to that as the fuckatol that I was administered in the event that I had to basically pull the Joker card and check out. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that Hunt did was not only handle me for the Mars program, but he was trying to handle me by wherever the CIA wanted me on the planet. And at the end of that summer of '81, right before I was going to enter my third year of college at UCLA, after having transferred from UC San Diego, he told me that I want you to put in an intercampus transfer. And I said, where? I've already attended 2 colleges. He said, Columbia. And I said, you're telling me if I apply to Columbia now, a couple of weeks before the term begins, I'm going to be able to go there to an Ivy League school? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, I don't want to go. I don't want to go to school in New York City. My family doesn't have the money for me to come home for Christmas if I do that. I don't think I can afford the rents or the danger of being a victim of a crime in New York, in that era. I mean, by 1979-80, New York was basically unsafe territory. So I made one of the major mistakes in my life, and I didn't transfer to Columbia to get an Ivy League degree as an undergraduate. But one of my fellow jumpers did, Barack Obama. As researched by George Stephanopoulos of ABC News, and who interviewed 400 classmates of Barack Obama. He was not in New York while he was supposedly attending Columbia. And also as field tested, or what have you, as researched by Wayne Allen Root, who was one of George Stephanopoulos and Barack Obama's classmates in class of '83 at Columbia. Wayne Allen Root, I believe he questioned 75 of their classmates, and they were all political science majors, as Obama was supposed to have been. And those 75 poli-sci graduates of the class of 1983 of Columbia University in New York City, none of them could place Barack Obama in New York City. What I can add to the controversy about the President's Columbia baccalaureate degree is that I was instructed by the CIA to transfer from UCLA to Columbia the same time he was, and he went. I've even communicated with one of the professors who's looking into this, saying, why won't you guys touch the issue of why he was even transferred to Columbia? What Hunt had told me is that they would simply use our shadow enrollment at Columbia as a cover for involving us in the jump room program further, and even espionage on Earth. We know that Barack Obama went to Pakistan in 1981 at a time when there was a travel ban on Americans going there that the State Department had imposed, the U.S. State Department had imposed. So Barack Obama shouldn't even have been allowed to have gone, apparently, to Pakistan as an undergrad, but he did. So he must have been using his Indonesian passport. Hence, he must have been registered at Columbia as an Indonesian or foreign student. All I know is that the term, the fall 1981 term that he decided or had earned the ability or the right to attend Columbia after having a B- grade point average at Occidental, he ended up graduating from Columbia, and I was instructed by CIA to go there, but didn't attend, but he apparently did because he was one of our fellow jumpers. And in fact, Courtney Hunt may have been the CIA agent who instructed him to put in the intercampus transfer and go to Columbia. So, 2 jump rooms, one in New York City and one in El Segundo, California. Here's the one at the corner of Imperial Avenue East and West in Sepulveda, 999 North Sepulveda. And Brett Stillings determined that the CIA building in El Segundo is exactly 2 miles as the bird flies from where the jump room itself was. Interesting finding, exactly 2 miles. The first of my 2 training jumps were in summer of 1981. The first time, it was always a tradition to go up by yourself, so you would be sufficient to go by yourself if you were called to do so. I went to the building in El Segundo, jumped to Mars, and then came out of an elevator that was 1 story below ground and out through the eye of a large skull. This is a large skull that I found in NASA image PIA 10214, but it's not the one that I arrived at. But the whole face on Mars controversy is now in its 2nd generation. The face on Mars at Cydonia is one of thousands of heads and faces of primates on the surface of Mars. The Martians use large heads to indicate where there are access points to their underground civilization, and they use images of different primates and reptilians and so forth to show, kind of as signage, to show where there's danger in the area. So they'll show a vicious reptoid, or they might show like a laughing humanoid as signage to indicate where you do or do not want to be on the surface. But they use large skulls extensively. The second time I went up with Courtney Hunt, and we went about a quarter of a mile from the skull that we arrived at, and this is one from Douglas, Arizona. It's just from our planet. But it was cobbled together from local rock. There was a door with a screen door on it. That's where I had the encounter with the man with the lower extremities of a grub who came bounding towards us with a chain around his neck, kind of like as a yard dog to scare us away. And when he got right towards us, Courtney Hunt kind of lunged at him like that, and he turned around and started bailing woefully like a wounded dog, which is a strange kind of guard dog. Then we went in and interacted with a settler on the surface of Mars named Howard. There were empty canned goods all over the floor, and he started scrambling and tripping over them because he thought we were there to assassinate him. And Courtney said, "Howard, we're not here to kill you. We're here just to see how you're doing." And he was just jabbering away how one of his team members had been a victim of predation and so forth. So this confirms the claims made by Michael C. Ralph that the U.S. government put settlers on Mars in structures like this, and also were having periodic jumpers, which again was part of the fulfilling the terms of public international law, that to claim territorial sovereignty you had to have settlers and then regular visitors to your colony to make that your own territory. Ultimately, I was given one mission. I would drive over to a RAND corporation, RAND of Santa Monica subsidiary, which is in West Los Angeles, California, and somebody there working in a kind of a printing shop for RAND would give me one of these black so-called floppy disks about 10 years before these were released commercially. And on it, there was data to sustain, here's just a jump room concept, elevator. But I would walk through this dilapidated brick city. This is Paris in 1945, but the city there was lower and brick. It looked like historical Philadelphia had been dropped from about 50 feet and kind of shattered on the ground. And I would walk through this with the data disk. I would walk through this dilapidated brick city, and remember seeing the little children of the second type of Martian, really cute in their long black caftans, looking out at me from behind vacant windows and doors and so forth. So what I was doing was taking that information to sustain the telecommunications posts that had been placed in that brick building. I don't know if that was our brick building or one of the Martian Typologies brick building, but it was brick and it was demolished, and our technician had cobbled together like 8 different devices inside an area of one of the brick buildings that was pretty much covered from the sky. And I would just arrive there, hand him the data disk, and he wouldn't even say anything. I'd say, "Well, I know you're not very talkative, but I do wish you the best here in your outpost." He just never talked to me. So what were the 3 typologies of Martians that I would ultimately encounter? I mentioned the first type. I have named them Homo Martis Terris, which basically means Earthman on Mars. The second is creepier. It has more of like the character that the German actor Max Schreck played in the 1922 classic silent film Nosferatu. This was Count Orlok, that he was actually a vampire in that movie. It's not exactly what the second type of Martians, the indigenous Martians that I've called Homo Martis Martis, or basically Martian men and women of Mars, but it's a little creepier than they actually look. They actually look a little cuter than this, or actually slightly cute, but kind of creepy at the same time. Their children are certainly very cute. But it's similar in the sense that he has an irregularly shaped dome on his head that we don't have. The face is longer from the crown to the bottom of the chin. The ears are sort of pointy. Some of them are horned, as we've long depicted demons and the devil himself. They have longer, more extended fingers than we do, spindlier bodies, but this character in cinema is pretty close because the Homo Martis Martis have a very recondite, even frightened personality. So it's really not their creepiness, it's our response to their fear of us. And if we're relatives of the Earthlings on Mars who colonized Mars before the solar system catastrophe in 9500 BC, they certainly have a right to have adapted into personalities in which they fear us, because it was members of our civilization that colonized their planet, for example, so that there was the liaison between Mars and Earth during the Egyptian, the high Egyptian civilization. In fact, Ross Curley of my organization, the Mars Anomaly Research Society, has found the image of a pharaoh either carved or stamped into a piece of rock or metal right on the Martian surface. So we have proven that the high Egyptian civilization was on Mars, and here's an indigenous Martian. Of course they would be frightened interacting with a human. So when Courtney Hunt and I were greeted at the opening of the jump room facility that was known as the Corkscrew, because it had sort of this not conical, but conch shell type structure, we were greeted by this little sort of Marty Feldman kind of character, who then was always looking back at us and kind of smiling vivaciously that he was leading us, and he was going to show us part of his underground civilization. So they were at least as, they were wary, but they were at least as interacting with Earthlings from Mars thousands of years after our respective civilizations had been separated, with at least enough graciousness to literally give us a tour of where they lived. And he did not attack us. He was quite kind to us. So we went for about a 30-minute walk through a part of their underground civilization. It was very Tolkien-esque. It had sweeping archways. It had ceilings that were sort of in paisley shapes. It had pneumatically driven metal equipment, like the kind of elevator that you might find in Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. So it was an advanced civilization living in a naturalistic way with the environment. Very interesting. The third type basically looked like gray extraterrestrials, but gray extraterrestrials sort of maybe crossbred with lemurs, a very terrestrial kind of primate, with a lot of like hiding activity, a lot of ducking, holding onto type of characteristics that we would find in higher primates. So the one I saw of those, which looked virtually identical to this, was on top of that jump room, the Corkscrew, when I yelled out, "Court, Brett, a gray, on the roof, observing us." Now, let me go through in part, what is that, part 16 now. Let me go through the 6 Mars whistleblowers who have come forward and tell something briefly about each of them. Michael C. Ralph, who's now resides in Australia with his wife Stephanie, who went through a major exercise in deprogramming involving his therapist wife, Stephanie Ralph, claims that in 1976 he went up to Mars via jump room, worked until 1996, and then was age regressed 20 years, and took the jump room back to Earth, and then was re-inducted into the conventional Army, and then given an honorable discharge a month later. Okay, what's interesting about this is Michael C. Ralph and I didn't know each other until I came forward publicly about the jump room program. And I remember being age progressed as a child in Pegasus and then having the effect wear off. And here we have one of the Mars jumpers describing that it was a jump room that he used to Mars. And after living and working there at one of the U.S. facilities, was age regressed back to 20 years younger, and then released from the military. I mean, that's double corroboration that I don't know how we would have made up not being in contact with each other. So the next whistleblower is Arthur Neumann, the Henry Deacon whistleblower from Project Camelot, who claims that sometime in the last several years he was sent to Mars via jump room by the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, and he wants me to emphasize that he has never been employed by the CIA. And then myself, coming forward in 2009 at a conference that was at James Gilliland's sanctuary near Trout Lake, Washington. And then after I came forward publicly, Laura Magdalene Eisenhower, the great-granddaughter of President Dwight David Eisenhower and Mamie Eisenhower, First Lady Mamie Eisenhower, came forward and revealed in a set of interviews in the alternative media that in 2006 and 2007 she had been basically mistreated in this elaborate sort of manipulation of her to fall in love with a particular boyfriend who was then grooming her to accept the invitation to go to Mars. And as I said earlier, I think it's remarkable that Laura, as a member of a presidential family, and a very respected one at that, the Eisenhower dynasty, would, as such a family member, come forward so courageously. And then, of course, Brett Stillings. I've talked about him at length. He's a great friend. Now we have Bernard Mendez, who, when Brett and I had met, in real time recently, and we're talking to each other about the jump room training class, we were always talking about that 35-year-old guy over on our left with his military escort. So who contacts us after I brought Brett onto Coast to Coast? Bernard Mendez, the guy over on the left side of the room. Bernie, as I said, is kind of like the Indiana Jones of rescuing U.S. government personnel, whether they're on the earth or off of it. Now, let's take a look at these two fellow jumper whistleblowers that I was blessed to have met. Brett Stillings and Bernard Mendez. The first fact that Brett and I corroborated with each other, we named our entire Mars training group that we could remember. Let me count how many people we cited and agreed to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So you've got two whistleblowers from the same project who together came up with 10 names of co-participants. That's fact number one. Fact number two is that we both remember that during our training, when Ed Dames was describing how dangerous it was on the surface, he said, of the 97,000 people that we have thus far sent to Mars, and I think he meant that we've settled on Mars, only 7,000 have survived after 5 years. Now, Bernie disputes that. Bernard Mendez says that there were only 4 groups of 10, 4 training classes of 10 young people, and several other CIA-aligned people that we were sending up with them. But Ed Dames, Brett, and I remember in the second fact, to corroborate, told us that 97,000 people had been sent up. 90,000 of them had lost their lives on the surface, and 7,000 had survived. And so now we surmise that maybe he was telling us this so we would be vigilant on the surface about protecting our lives and the lives of our team members. He also remembered that when Ed Dames was talking, and I agree, that when Ed Dames was talking about predation, he said, so does everybody understand what I'm really saying here? Simply put, your task is to be seen and not eaten. In other words, your task is to be present on the surface, acclimating the Martian humanoids and animals to your presence, but making sure that one of the animals doesn't eat you. So Brett's come up with some highly specific data points from our training and from our experience. You remember on the surface, he was sitting at a table with his back to the entire horizon. I was standing in front of him doing like these 30-second looks here, and then 180 degrees to my right, and then I would step back kind of like this and look at whether there were predators there, and I felt exposed behind myself, so I would then turn and look over here every 30 seconds, just like somebody holding a rifle protecting, a group of soldiers in a war zone. And Brett had been sitting there for 3 minutes with his back to the whole horizon on this kind of stone picnic table type structure. And he remembers that I kind of took him to task. I was always kind of like playing the role of his older brother. And he says that I said, Brett, were you giving any training? And Brett said, what? What do you mean? And I said, 3 minutes have passed and you haven't looked around. So we were really trying to protect each other, really keep each other alive. So the next slide, please. We also remembered something that makes absolutely no sense. On Earth, when you enter an elevator, if you push a certain number, it'll take you to that floor. The door will close and it will take you to that floor. But if you push the number of the floor you're on, it'll open to protect anybody from being injured by the elevator, being caught between the elevator and the elevator shaft. But Brett and I both remembered that to get home from the Mars jump rooms on Mars, we were pushing the number of the floor we were on, because some of these jump room facilities had almost like a mine shaft kind of elevator, like a mine elevator, where you had basically the box-like elevator on some level of the shaft. So if we went in and it was on level 5, and we had to push 5 to cause the doors to close, not remain open for pushing the same number as the number of the floor. He remembers that after closing the door by doing that, we were then instructed to look up at the ceiling at a 45-degree angle, and in a loud, clear voice, when they said, "Are you ready to return?" we were sort of shouting almost, "Ready to return." So Brett and I basically corroborated and remembered, and were able to dispel the possibility that we were part of some mind control experiment or we were having a group dream or something, because we we went back and we remembered the whole elaborate system for getting home in the jump room via the jump room on Mars. Similarly, Bernie remembered that several of the more difficult facts that we've had to grope with, grasp, analyze, regarding our trips to Mars. One is, and this was very strange, Bernie and Regina came over to my dorm at UCLA, and Bernie had a backpack on his back and green pants, and he had a green sweater over his upper torso that created a hump, basically, in this green sweater. And I said, Bernie, what's the deal? What are you wearing? You look like a turtle. I was just teasing him, trying to loosen him up. And Bernie's from Staten Island. He still lives there. And he reminded me, right after he contacted me after 30 years, that I had once alleged that he looked like a turtle. And I think that's kind of a highly specific, personal kind of issue that could not just be made up or falsely remembered after 30 years. So that was fact number one that corresponded. I said, yeah, I remember that, Bernie. I didn't mean to, I wasn't picking on you. I was just saying that, you had a hump on the back of this green sweater. Okay, second one was, we remembered that during a jump that we took, the one where I referred to him as looking like a turtle when he showed up at the dorms, that we went on a night run with Regina Dugan, and here in this PowerPoint I had written another woman. I now have the permission of the Eisenhower family to reveal that that was Mary Jean Eisenhower, President Eisenhower's granddaughter, namely the aunt of Laura Magdalene Eisenhower. So there was family involvement. Raymond F. Basiago and his son Andrew Basiago, Thomas J. Stillings and his son William Brett Stillings, and Mary Jean Eisenhower, who would go on to be the president of the People-to-People Ambassador Program, that second-level diplomacy agency that her grandfather founded, and her niece, Laura Eisenhower. And I'm sure other family members were involved in that way, because after all, they were going to be moving towards a colony on Mars, and I think they were involving people in different ways, so that ultimately there would be family integrity if they then wanted to bring more members of the family into the colony. For example, Laura was invited, when she was invited to go up in 2006 and 2007, they were trying to get her to consent to bringing her two then 10-year-old twin boys with her. But initially with Bernie, we corroborated the fact that after they picked me up at the dorms, we slept from about 5 o'clock to 1 o'clock in the morning at a military dormitory in El Segundo near the jump room site. Bernie and I corroborated, and this was one of the reasons we wanted to speak with Mary Jean, but we haven't been able to, at least as of yet. We remember during the night run that we were chased around in front of the jump room facility called the Corkscrew by these small dinosaur-like creatures. They weren't like T-Rex, but they were more sort of horizontal creatures with little pommels on top of their head. Not horns, but just a kind of a pommeled head, like a hammerhead shark. And when we were doing so, something completely outside the bounds of normal physics occurred. We could see our team members running around being chased by these small dinosaurs, while there was a spotlight in the ground below us, just like on a disco dance floor, kind of. But there was no searchlight on top of us, like from a Klieg light. And it was dirt, so the question is, how is it being illuminated? And there was no evidence of shadow casting either. It was a light beneath us that wasn't picking up our own shadow, which means it was basically being created there out of whole cloth. And also that, if you could go to the next one, please, that during that chase, my right arm was pulled off, and when I got to the debriefing that was held, or with Regina and I being debriefed by Major Dames and Bernard Mendez at the debriefing room in the sub-basement of the El Segundo jump room site, somehow the arm that had bitten off then had already been reattached or had materialized back on my arm. And my arm, I keep on dislocating this arm to the point where I can't even really tie my tie or correct my collar when I put my shirt on. So I'm wondering whether that's a medical side effect of having my arm torn off. Bernie witnessed it. Regina witnessed the arm being torn off. All of the individuals on that jump, Mary Jean Eisenhower, saw that my arm was missing. There was just some tissue hanging from my shoulder. But sometime between the time we entered the jump room on Mars and got back to the El Segundo jump room facility, my arm was completely normal. And Bernie remembered standing here with Ed Dames sitting here, and me sitting here, over here, looking at them, and Regina next to me there, sitting, looking towards Bernie. And I was, remonstrating. I was saying things like, thanks guys, you know, I'm not only a righty, but I'm a writer, and you know, I've lost my arm for life. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the favor. And Bernie then said, Andy, I want you to take your left hand and reach over and see whether you can touch your right arm. So just do that for me. And I did. I said, yeah, Bernie, is it back on? He goes, yeah, now just turn your head to the right and look at your arm. Do you have an arm? And I said, yeah, Bernie, what happened? He says, we don't know, but this is one of the reasons I'm in the program. We're trying to figure out why people are being eaten, you know, basically bitten to death by some of the predators, killed. Some of them are having limbs pulled off like this. And before they even get home, via the jump room, they've got their full life back and their full bodily integrity back, and we don't know what's causing it. I think what may have been going on is that the jump room was not a teleporter, it was a chronovisor. So that holographic effects were being created, like losing your arm in the mouth of a predator, but then the resilience of the quantum hologram was causing those negative experiences to be reversed, but sort of there's enough resilience in the jump room device to literally put you back, not back on, just back on Earth, but in the condition you had been in before you left. But I do have an arm, but I have this chronic bursitis in my right shoulder that doesn't seem to relate to any other injury. I mean, I never injured it in athletics in high school or whatever. I just have a bum shoulder right where they pulled my right arm off. Ow. And Bernie also reminded me that the next day he called me at UCLA and through the counter there at my dorm and told somebody there to actually go up and contact me in my room. And they did. And they said, you have to call Bernard Mendez. So I went to a payphone and called Bernie, and he said, Andrew, suit up. Andrew, suit up, because we're going back up. And I said, when, Bernie? He said, today. I have a theory of what was actually going on. And so I meet Bernie at the El Segundo jump room site. We get in the jump room. He gives the high sign to the operator. And we're sent up there to the same facility, the corkscrew. And as we're jumping, Bernie is going, now listen, when we walk outside of the jump room, I want you to be peaceful and calm and project feelings of love and acceptance to whatever we encounter. It may be the dinosaur-like creatures that attacked you last night. It may be some of the Martians or whatever. But just walk out of the jump room in an attitude of Christ-like peace and acceptance and understanding. And I said, why, Bernie? What's the deal? What's your theory? He goes, I don't want to tell you, but let's just see what happens. So I do that, and we walk over to sort of like this herd of the animals that attacked us. And they didn't chase us, they didn't bite at us. So we went even closer to them like cows, and we petted the tops of their heads with this pommeled crown on their head. And they started mewing like whales. You know, in this kind of real deep, profound kind of feeling of acceptance or joy or peace or whatever. They were going kind of like, as we were petting them. And then Bernie said, let's go home. And he said, I think what this experience on Mars is telling us, that whatever we project into the cosmos, it'll feed back. We've been in some kind of solipsistic loop. When we brought our fear up there, they attacked us. But when we brought peace and understanding up there, they let us pet them, because they realized that we weren't going to do them any harm. So he said, this is a major finding. And I also think we're clearly in some kind of artificial environment, because how elsewise could we see you lose your arm and have it be back on your shoulder by the time you got back to El Segundo? So Bernie and I corroborated that right after he contacted Brett and I. Bernie's a pretty remarkable man. Among his past associates were Howard R. Hughes and President Nixon, who, as I mentioned yesterday, may have lost his presidency in the Watergate scandal because he was trying to police the abuse of time travel to create large billion-dollar fortunes. And Bernie also corroborated the involvement of Obama, Dugan, my dad, and the time when he and I met Admiral Stansfield T. Turner, who had just served as the Director of Central Intelligence for President Carter, before we started jumping in '81, now into the early first Reagan administration. Stansfield Turner came out of one of the jump room facilities and walked over to Bernie and I said, do you remember how I said, oh, it's Peter Byrne, the Bigfoot hunter, kind of as a joke? Because Admiral Turner had like a pith helmet, a cravat, and like a tan short-sleeve shirt, shorts, and hiking boots. He looked like a kind of a mountain climber. And he said, hi, gentlemen, Stan Turner. And so we know that this former Director of Central Intelligence went up and was one of the jumpers. Bernie also, for my benefit, I'm deeply grateful for it, recounted the fact that my dad was sort of an acquaintance of his who was frequently speaking with him as a result of being on the project together. And he revealed to me that my dad really desperately wanted to go up and do a co-jump with his fifth child. And he was just ecstatic, Bernie said, when he was approved to go up, because as Mars came towards Earth, and we would only spend, let's say, 8 minutes in the jump room rather than 20, my dad was medically approved to go up, and we went up together in May of 1984. My dad actually had a medical escort with him to protect his health. So now, I mean, this may be anachronistic now, I think it's 17 Mars program participants that we've been able to identify by name. Here we have Mary Jean Eisenhower, who would go on to be the director of the People to People Ambassador program. When I met her, when we met after we had taken our nap there at the military dormitory at El Segundo for the night run, she said, "Hi, Andy, Mary Jean Eisenhower." And I said, "Oh, really? Are you a descendant of President Eisenhower?" And she said, "Yep, the one and only." And Laura confirms that that sounds like her aunt. And again, Admiral Stansfield Turner, an Annapolis graduate. There again is not just the Navy connection, but the Annapolis connection. And a former director of Central Intelligence, again, the CIA connection to the jump room program. So, after Brett and Bernie and I corroborated aspects of each other's accounts, but they kind of ran the gamut from physically going there to the actual Mars in real time versus visiting on a holographic or chronovisor-based, hologram of Mars or some other planet or planetoid. Kind of a range of opinions emerged between Brett, Bernie, and I about where we had actually gone in time-space when jumping to Mars. Brett has always defended, I think, the honorable and supportable position that we were going to Mars, the planet, in real time. He noted among the evidence that the Martian moons Phobos and Deimos were always in their proper locations and trajectories and locations relative to each other in the Martian sky. They're rather small, actually, smaller than our moon for sure. He remembered how Courtney M. Hunt of the CIA had told he and I that the Viking 2 apparatus was about 20 miles from the jump room facility known as the Corkscrew, but we shouldn't try to walk it. And in fact, Brett and I both have memories of having been placed near there via teleportation, where there's a kind of an historical shrine where the Viking 2 set down on the surface of Mars. Brett has made the point that NASA cannot be relied on to provide accurate data about Mars of any kind because it has an established history of lying about the natural conditions on Mars. So the brilliant proof that William B. Stillings has framed is that if, as NASA tells us, the atmospheric pressure on Mars is 8 millibar, then the deployment of the NASA rovers Spirit, Opportunity, and Curiosity would have required a parachute the size of the continental United States. Okay, we've all seen the footage. They've said how we put this, we had ensnared or surrounded the rover with these balloons that then broke apart on the ground. But we were slowing the descent of that package with a parachute. I'll show you a picture later of the parachute that was used for, or supposedly used for, the rover Curiosity. And Brett calculated that in order to drop these, to deploy the rovers via parachute, you would need an atmospheric pressure of more like 800 millibar on Mars. Here's the parachute that was used to put Curiosity on the surface of Mars. It certainly doesn't look like the size of the continental United States, which would be needed for 8 millibar pressure. You know, with that little pressure against the parachute, you have so many less molecules of air that air would have to literally stretch across the entire country to be used for resistance to the parachute. So there we have it, the one that was being published when Curiosity was launched. Bernie, for his part, noted the time when we were chased by the dinosaurs and I got my arm back, and the weird lighting effect, and then an event that we call the causal loop, where one of our members got killed, and we went back to El Segundo, but then back to retrieve his body. And the same event scenario unfolded 3 times, basically a causal loop, where in the second and third repetition of the same event scenario. We had the consciousness that we had previously been in the first and then the second event scenario. So it was like extended deja vu with knowledge of what we had just done, and had just done the same thing before. So I asked him, Bernie, what should we call it? And he said, well, we should have a word that means that it was just constructed artificially and that it involves some kind of advanced quantum engineering. And I said, how about synthetic quantum environment to create an artificial holographic planetary domain? And he said, that's it. So what Bernie has been stating for a long time and defending is that we weren't going to Mars, we were going to basically SQE subnotation Mars, an artificial environment, not the natural one. In support of that premise, he's noted that Mars was out of position when most of the jumps took place, that Mars' atmosphere is deficient in oxygen to sustain human life, but that's not true because we have blue skies there, which I spoke of before they were found by Mars anomalists, that the gravity on the surface was stronger than it would have been on Mars. In fact, he was correct. If Mars is 40% of the mass of Earth, the average adult male takes a 3-foot stride. So I and Brett and Courtney Hunt and so forth, my father, if Earth is 2.5 times more massive than Mars, the normal stride of 3 feet on Earth should have resulted in 7.5 feet of travel on Mars. So either both Earth and Mars are much more hollow than science supports, or the Earth is hollow and Mars is solid, or we were not going to Mars, because we were only able to bound about 4 feet in a normal stride. In fact, Brett and I walked across the surface one time with Courtney Hunt, and he said, you know, Andy, Brett, I want you to kind of listen up. Take a normal step here like you would. Did you just notice that we went as far as you would have if you kind of skipped across a creek? Okay, that's because we're leaping 4 feet rather than 3 when we make a normal stride, but we should be able to be going much further. And then Brett said something like, yeah, we're about 7-8 feet, right? And Hunt said yes. So this is a bit of a scientific mystery that the program is dealing with. Okay, so the gravity, which should have been stronger on the surface of Mars, the temperatures are, as reported by NASA, that would be, for example, in the Wikipedia entry on Mars, are supposed to range from 175 below 0 Fahrenheit to a positive 225 degrees Fahrenheit, namely basically broiling hot conditions, which are not survivable for creatures like us. And then also, Bernie noted that Mars' lack of an ionosphere, which was blown off during that cataclysm in 9500 BC, would have irradiated us on the surface, and so he concluded that the destination was a synthetic quantum environment, that the gray extraterrestrials were testing our responses to being on the threshold of cosmic contact, that of interplanetary visitation, exploration, and communication with extraterrestrials. So I kind of took the middle position with both of them because I was trying to keep sort of our camaraderie together. And I said, okay, Brett and Bernie, what about if we were going to Mars in real time, which, for example, was proved on his first trip to Mars when Brett says that he bent over on the ground and tasted the soil, and it tasted like dirt on Earth, like when you're hiking and you get some dust in your mouth or whatever. But that it was via not teleportation, but exoplanetary holography, basically chronovision. That would explain why we were interacting to the most fine degree of specificity with the actual Mars, but we were in some kind of holographic environment in which novel input could have been inserted, like the loss of my arm. Or the causal loop could have been just a repetition within a synthetic quantum environment. And that has become the position of Bernie and I. We think that the explanation actually is that we were going to the actual Mars via exoplanetary chronovision. So the evidence is that we were trained for Mars and believed that we were visiting it, and our instructors and program administrators were telling us that we were going to Mars. But the origin and function of the jump rooms remains totally unknown. Bernie says they were from the gray ETs, but we were certainly never told that. We were working with these brilliant physicists and engineers from Parsons and Lockheed Skunk Works. Howard Hughes may have played a role because we were in a Hughes aircraft building there in El Segundo. Another thing that kind of supports Brett's basic notion that we're going to the actual Mars is the fact that when spring of 1984 arrived, the distance between the actual Mars and the actual Earth had been shortened, and hence our time in the jump room from 20 to 8 minutes, and that's why my father was approved to go, because of his heart disease and pulmonary condition. And at the same time, even though the fact that the closeness of the two planets strongly argues for Brett's position, we can't deny the fact that during the jump room, which Brett was not part of, but that Bernie, Regina, and Mary Jean and I were on, strongly indicated that we were visiting some kind of hologram. Okay, so where we are now is basically, it had to have been sort of both. We were going to the real Mars, but in a non-ordinary way. So there's been two unofficial presidential denials by President Obama, one of the participants. After Brett Stillings, Laura Eisenhower appeared on Coast on November 10th of 2011, about a little bit more than a month later, in January of 2012, an article was planted by the Obama administration in Wired.com. And in that January 4th, 2012, literally what? That's about 60 days later, they planted a story in which Tommy Vidor, the spokesman for the National Security Council, okay, the National Security Council includes the President, the Vice President, the Secretaries of State and Defense, the National Security Advisor, the Assistant National Security Advisor, and their spokesperson. At the time that this article was planted in Wired.com, Tommy Vidor, who had just served as the point man on the Certificate of Live Birth controversy, in the birther controversy, planted a room in the danger room column. Again, that's sort of the use of threatening terms to stigmatize certain discourse in our country. In the danger room column of Wired.com, he officially denied, or at least denied, as a spokesman for the White House, that Obama has never gone to Mars. And he said, only if you count watching Marvin the Martian has he ever gone to Mars, which I think is a really pretty ridiculous statement. But then, of course, that's exactly what a secret chrononaut wants you to believe. And who were they referring to as secret chrononaut making this claim about Obama? Yours truly. I had begun to refer to myself as a U.S. chrononaut. So they did what has been done regarding the extraterrestrial issue since the Durant report of the CIA's Robertson panel was published in 1953, which was to deny claims of extraterrestrial life and subject the claimants to public smear campaigns involving fear and ridicule. And here it is in 2012, January 2012. He didn't go to Mars. He's just seen Mars on a cartoon. But the assertion that he did go to Mars is exactly what a secret chrononaut wants you to believe. Now, so you may know why I'm speaking out. My government has ridiculed me for serving it voluntarily without pay or benefits in journeying to another planet. Totally unacceptable for American culture to accept. Here is the rover Curiosity, and when this was released and deployed on Mars, this is what President Obama said. As quoted in the Los Angeles Times on Montauk Day of August 13th of 2012, isn't that interesting? The time, in other words, between 1943 and 1983, when the Philadelphia experiment supposedly opened up a tunnel that led to Project Montauk being founded on August 13th of 1983, while we were jumping to Mars. He said, and I thought this was an extremely conceited statement, but I have to quote it because it's what his response was to the deployment of the rover Curiosity, now 8 months after the Wired.com piece. If in fact you do make contact with Martians, please let me know right away. I've got a lot of other things on my plate, but I suspect that would go to the top of the list, even if they're just microbes. Okay, now this is not presidential leadership, so let me kind of parse this statement. If in fact you do make contact with Martians, he made contact with Martians. I made contact with Martians in his career, not somebody else's even. Please let me know right away, implying that he has no concept, right, of having gone to Mars. I've got a lot of other things on my plate. So here's the leader of the United States that passed legislation in 1958 tasking the space agency with its primary mission of fostering the expansion of human knowledge of space and the near-Earth environment. Saying that he's got a lot of other things on his plate, like, you know, this Mars stuff should be dissed. I don't think George Washington would have dissed outer space exploration. I don't think Jefferson would have. The Roosevelts, John Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, some of my favorite presidents in terms of who they were. Here we have actually a U.S. chrononaut serving as president, soon to be re-elected the second time, not revealing that he was a U.S. chrononaut and participant in the secret space program, telling the American people that he had other things on his plate rather than addressing whether we live in an inhabited solar system. But I suspect that would go to the top of the list, even if they're just microbes, like NASA has been telling everybody. Like when they released that discovery of a fossil of a microbe on a Martian meteorite at UCLA in 1984. So again, this isn't leadership. This is leadership by proxy. It's leadership by disinformation, by even the President of the United States citing previous disinformation campaigns. Oh, that it's all just microbes. Well, wait a minute. If I showed the first images of humanoids on Mars in 2008, even if you want to take my story about going there and just push it into the dustbin of history and never try to prove it or believe it, I still showed in my paper that Mars is inhabited by humanoids. So why, almost 4 years later, is one of my former Mars colleagues stating that, well, when they do find something, it might just be microbes? Okay? We are basically being suffocated by disinformation, by an entirely disingenuous form of government that constantly lies to us. And knowing that we went to Mars and did so as colleagues, how can I not run for president, try to correct this garbage? So, you know, I love Barry like a brother. He's really a fine person. But he's been playing the insider's game of basically not telling the truth to the American people about fundamental questions like, is our neighboring planet inhabited with humanoids like us? So, what is the result of? What is he adhering to? He's adhering to the findings of the Durant report. Here's physicist Durant. That was a paper that was produced by the CIA's Robertson panel, which met in 1952 and 3, and then he released his report in 1953. And I mentioned how its basic thrust was to deny the existence of ET life, debunk the reports, even though the Chinese are putting UFO sightings on the front page of the People's Daily, and to subject those making reports of ET life to public smear campaigns involving ridicule, fear and ridicule. Well, that's what they did on the Colbert Report. They told me they wanted to do a legitimate piece, a legitimate interview with me in studio about how teleportation had been developed 40 years ago. And then they parodied me as Barack Obama's gay lover on Mars. No, I'm a former U.S. chrononaut, and I went there. And I happen to be straight. I happen to be an avowed heterosexual, believe it or not. So, one presidential campaign, next slide please, is going to occur in 2016. When I run, I'm going to first of all be adhering to the truth principle. I'm going to admit the existence of ET life as a candidate and then as president if I'm elected. I'm going to publish reports of ET life on the White House website to reverse this 60 years of lying. And I'm going to support the proposition that the people have a human right to know about the cosmos that we inhabit, including the fact that it is an inhabited cosmos. We have to stop telling lies to our children. This is a pathetic situation. We are biological organisms on a planet, on a tiny rocker arm of the Milky Way galaxy, approximately 165 million light years from the center of that galaxy. We are ultimately insignificant, but in and of ourselves, ultimately ultra-significant as life forms, as intelligent beings. And it is not functional as a civilization to be lying to ourselves and our children about the basic situation that we're in. That on that tiny little planet, in that tiny little obscure solar system, on that rocker arm, 165 million light years from the center of our galaxy, we have neighbors that are over on the next planet, okay, the next campsite. It's not Buzz Aldrin, it's 3 types of Martians. So, my Mars policy is going to be also, in addition just to the truth principle regarding extraterrestrialism, my Mars policy is going to admit the U.S. presence on Mars. I'm going to lay it out. I'm going to sit down with Steve Croft on 60 Minutes and say, what I'm saying, Steve, you can corroborate through my defense secretary or my Mars jumper colleague Bernard Mendez, but we're telling the truth, okay, and then go through the whole history of the Mars jumper program. I'm going to declassify the CIA's Mars files so that the English translation of those 4 inches of French intelligence documents, for example, will be posted on the White House website. And I will sponsor the promulgation of an international treaty under, presumably, the UN, protecting Mars' ecology and civilization from visitation, exploration, habitation, and colonization by human beings from Earth. The report is from David Wilcock, and certainly as corroborated by Laura's experience in 2006 and 2007 of she and her two twin boys being invited up there. David Wilcock stated in December of 2009, after I was on Coast in November of 2009, on Coast to Coast AM, he said, yes, there is a Mars colony, and when George Norrie asked him how big it is, he said, what I've been told is that presently it has 550,000 inhabitants. So if it's true, I mean, I haven't been in the program since 1984, but if it's true that we've placed 500,000 humans on Mars, first of all, I would ask, what gave us the right? Did it involve a territorial acquisition, our hegemony being directed at the Martian civilization, or was it based on a treaty with the Martians, and if so, why? And then, why weren't the people told? We were told about landing on the moon. We weren't told about placing 500,000 people on an adjacent planet. It is not acceptable. So, next slide, please. What I'm going to do regarding Barry is I'm going to ask him to admit his role in the Mars Jump Room program after he's president, when there wouldn't be any retaliation for releasing a state secret, indeed a military secret, as Commander-in-Chief. Once he leaves the White House, whether he's followed by me or somebody else and then I enter the presidency, I'm going to ask him to admit his role. I'm going to ask him for a joint appearance where we'll talk about our experiences in the Mars Jump Room program. And I'm going to ask him to appear with me at the College of the Siskiyous to give complimentary speeches on space exploration as the destiny of the human race, not something to be concealed, and then to give all living Mars jumpers the Space Medal of Honor. Brett and I were told by Courtney Hunt, and he by his father also, that all of us secretly earned the Congressional Medal of Honor. And I said, Brett, that's for like valor in combat. He said, but that's what I was told. And I said, you know something? That's what I was told, that we actually were secretly, like an affidavit was placed in our file that said we had been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. I think it was probably evolved into the Space Medal of Honor. But of all of us who went there, whether it was the actual Mars or a synthetic quantum environment, we were leaving Earth. I mean, the jump room was taking us someplace in time-space. And yet we weren't paid, we weren't benefited, we received no military decorations, and we were involved in something that could have urgently caused us to lose our life. And so just to recognize those who have served, I'm going to ask the General Accounting Office to give me a list of everybody who served, and then we're going to decorate them there with Obama and I pinning their medals on their chest. So, to do that, I have to win in my campaign of Andy 2016, A Time for Truth. And so, just as it was a cosmic privilege for me to serve in Project Pegasus in the Mars Jump Room program, I hope that in the wisdom of the American people, I'm given the cosmic privilege to serve as their president, and I would ask you for your support. So thanks very much for coming today, and now maybe we should take a short break and then maybe open up the room for questions. So thank you for coming, and for hearing this true story.